Today we go into a bit of game theory and talk about the prisoner's dilemma. Now, the prisoner's dilemma is extremely important for understanding how oligopolies behave. But before we apply the prisoner's dilemma to firms, let's think how it might relate to demons. Imagine it's a few thousand years ago, and our city is about to go to war. And it's going to be a horrible, terrible war, especially for the loser. The city that loses will have all of its citizens killed or enslaved. Just as our troops are about to march off to fight the other city, the demon Moloch appears. And Moloch says, I will give +7 killing power for all of your troops, and I'll take away +7 killing power for your enemy. In return, you have to sacrifice 100 people, 100 healthy, loved citizens of your city. Well, should we accept? Well, +7 killing power, let's imagine this is quite a bit. So we'll save a lot more on average by accepting Moloch's deal than if we reject Moloch's deal. So we talk about it, we're like, yeah, we don't want to have to kill 100 of our own people, but losing this war would just be so horrible that we've got to do it. And as we're about to accept the demon Moloch's offer, Moloch says, oh, and because I'm an honest demon who practices full disclosure, know this. At this very instant, I'm making this exact same deal to your enemy. Well, does that change anything? Now, if both ourselves and our enemies accept Moloch's offer, then this all cancels out. Except, of course, we'll each have sacrificed 100 of our own citizens. So Moloch will have made us all worse off if we both accept his offer. But I still think we need to accept his offer. I mean, if the other side accepts the offer and we don't, we're probably going to lose. And, well, that's worse than, sacrificing 100 of our own citizens. Because, if we both accept, let's say our chances of winning is 50%. And, of course, if the other side doesn't accept, but we do, then we almost certainly win. And that's better than having a 50% chance of winning. So no matter what our enemies do, we should accept Moloch's offer. Now, of course, we should expect our enemies to think the same way. So both of us will accept this demon's offer, and we both will have killed 100 people for nothing. But, this goes to show that demons don't always act in your best interests. What I just explained in terms of Moloch is a version of what's called the prisoner's dilemma. Let me now give you an official interpretation of the prisoner's dilemma, which is going to involve prisoners. So now let's say you are a murderer. You really, really genuinely killed someone, and you killed someone with someone else with a co-conspirator. The police arrest you and your co-conspirator, and they find an illegal weapon on each of you. And they can put you in jail each for 1 year for having this illegal weapon. But you wiped off the gun, you did something to mess up the ballistics, so the police can't prove that you committed murder. They know you did it, but they can't prove it, unless one or both of you confess. So here's the situation the police are in. They have the right to put both of you in jail for 1 year for illegal weapons possession. If one or both of you confess, then they can put both of you in jail for life. So it now seems obvious, right? You and your co-conspirator should say, well, it's too bad, we got caught with an illegal weapon. We don't want to go to jail for a year. But oh gosh, we certainly shouldn't say anything to the police, because as long as we keep silent, we only go to jail for a year and not for life for murder. So what can the police do? Well, the police can throw you in what's called, yeah, you guessed it, the prisoner's dilemma. Now, the police will do what you've seen happen many, many times on cop shows. They separate you and your co-conspirator. They place each in a separate room, and they have someone interrogate each of you, and they say, you better confess, because if you do confess, you'll get a better deal than if you don't. And even if you don't confess, we know your co-conspirator right now is ratting you out. So the police offer you this following deal. So the police offer you the following deal. So remember, you are in a separate room from your co-conspirator, and they're, one police officer's talking to you and one is talking to him. And they say, based on who confesses, well, you'll get the following prison sentence. If you're the only one who confesses, if the guy you committed the crime with stays silent, we'll actually let you go free. Now, if neither of you confess, well, we'll send you both to jail for a year because that's the most we can do. If both of you confess, even though we could send both of you to jail for life, you'll only go to jail for 20 years. We'll give you a bit of a break. And if just the other guy confesses, well, you'll go to jail for life. So what should you do? Well, the prisoner's dilemma would hold that you should confess. And of course, the other person, your co-conspirator, should also confess, so you both go to jail for 20 years. You both know this. Now, this result is extremely counterintuitive. You're both doing something where you know will result in both of you going to jail for 20 years, but if each of you stayed silent, you'd go to jail for 1 year. How can you be this stupid, especially since the prisoner's dilemma is assuming the prisoners are super rational? Let's go through it. All right. Hypothetically, you know your co-conspirator is going to confess. You just know from his personality he is definitely the type that's going to confess. What should you do? Well, if you confess, you get 20 years in jail. If you don't confess, you go to jail for life. 20 years is a long time, but life is worse. So if you knew for certain that your co-conspirator was going to confess, you'd want to confess. All right, well, now let's take the opposite case. You know that your co-conspirator is going to stay silent. That, that's the worst thing. He cares a lot about honor among criminals. He would never talk to the police. You're completely certain he's not going to confess. What should you do? Well, if you confess, you get to go free. And if you don't confess, you spend a year in prison. Well, it's better going free than spending a year in prison. Now, what about your own sense of honor? Well, you are a murderer. In this hypothetical, you actually have killed someone. So it doesn't really make sense to think that you have a strong sense of honor. Or if you do have a strong sense of honor, wouldn't you think it's better at least one of the two of you go to jail for a long time? So you really should confess. So if your co-conspirator confesses, you should confess. And if your co-conspirator doesn't confess, you should confess. So you should confess no matter what. He should think the same, and you both should confess. Now, this is a trap. It's a dilemma. But there's nothing you can do about it, because even taking this into account, right, and you'll say, okay, I don't want to get caught in this dilemma, so I don't confess. But then your co-conspirator, he would find it in the interest to confess. Now, if you're each in the same room and you could coordinate your actions, probably you'd both stay silent, because each of you would figure if I say something, that's going to trigger the other guy saying something. But in the prisoner's dilemma, you're talking in a separate room, and whether your co-conspirator confesses is independent of whether you confess. He's either going to confess or not confess, and that has nothing to do with whether you confess or don't confess. So your choices are either among the first two, if the other guy doesn't confess, and you're better off just you than neither, or between the second two, and you're better off with both confess than just him. So you're always better off confessing, which is, again, very paradoxical. If you've never heard this before, you're not sure I'm telling you the truth, but, look it up. I'm definitely on. This is the result of the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma gets at where rational people acting in their self-interest can all collectively wind up worse off. And it's a paradoxical result, but it's also very important, and it gets at a lot of behavior. Let's apply prisoner's dilemma-like reasoning to 3 scenarios. The first is one where there's a curved exam. So there's a class of, say, at least 12 people, and the professor has this fixed distribution of grades. The person who does the best gets an A, the person who does the worst gets an F, the people in the middle all get Bs. And you all know this. So before the exam, you all say to each other, why should we study? I mean, if all of us study, we'll probably on average get each the same grade as if none of us study, but none of us study. Well, we don't have to study. We save a lot of time. So wouldn't we all be better off just agreeing not to study? And everyone's, yeah, definitely. We're all better off not studying. Yeah, let's all not study. Then, of course, everyone goes home and studies their butts off, hoping that everyone else actually studied, or actually didn't study. See, the professor can count on the prisoner's dilemma pushing students to study. Because if no one keeps to the deal of not studying, well, you want to study or you'll do badly. And if everyone keeps to the deal of not studying, well, you also want to study because now you'll do really well. You'll get a higher grade than otherwise. So this is the prisoner's dilemma, pushing, everyone to study even though they know they're kind of in this trap. All right, the next situation, steroids and athletics. Let's imagine that there is some drug that really will help athletes perform better, but the drug is kind of dangerous. And it will, shorten your life, shrink things you don't want shrunk. It'll do bad things. But this is a sport where if you're one of the best in this area, it's really going to be good. You'll have money, fame, lots of dating opportunities. Well, all the athletes together, collectively, let's none of us use the drug because that way no one gets an unfair advantage. But, well, then the athletes will all go cheat and try to use the drug. Because, right, if no one else uses steroids and you do, you gain an advantage. You're much more likely to be the top athlete and win lots of money and fame. And of course, if everyone in the sport is using the drug, well, then if you don't use it, you have no hope of competing. So prisoner's dilemma pushes people to use the drug. I should say for listeners here, this really only is sane if you're in a sport where being one of the top performers pays off a lot. I mean, if you're taking steroids to be a slightly better high school wrestler, you're just an idiot. It's not worth the cost. All right, final example is dress codes in high school. So in high school, students compete with each other to dress nicely. And let's just, you can see, all the students get together and say, hey, let's not compete by dressing really nicely. That way we don't have to spend all this money on clothes and none of us has this unfair advantage and everyone agrees. But then people will still come in, dressing really nicely. So there's a way around this, though, and this is where dress codes come in. You can imagine the parents getting together, and let's say the parents are saying, gosh, I'm spending all this money on my daughter's clothing. And why? Well, she's telling me that if I don't buy her really expensive clothing, she'll be at a competitive disadvantage in the social scene in her high school. And so why don't we all just go to a PTA meeting and let's just vote to make our students wear the same dress, and that way no one's at a disadvantage. And, the other parents are like, yeah, I'm spending money because my daughter's telling me I need to because you're spending the money. So let's all we'll make it all the same. This is a way of overcoming the prisoner's dilemma. Now, whenever you overcome a prisoner's dilemma, though, there's always going to be incentives to cheat. So, for example, let's imagine this dress code covers everything but shoes. People will put enormous effort into having the nicest shoes. So then, the next year the PTA says, all right, we've got to cover shoes too. There'll be standard shoes. So then it'll be hairstyle or makeup or jewelry, and people will keep expanding it. So people are often in a prisoner's dilemma, and they try to get out of it, but then there's incentives to cheat. So let's go to the official prisoner's dilemma involving prisoners. What's the solution? Well, the solution is you join the mafia, and you're in the mafia, and they'll say, hey, you talk to the police. Yeah, they'll let you get out of prison if you confess, but guess what? We're going to track you down and kill you. Well, okay. So then what do the police do? Well, the police will say, okay, well, we'll put you in witness protection, or we won't make it seem like you confess. You don't confess to the crime and testify in court. Just tell us where the evidence is buried, but our case against you will fall apart, and yet we'll find evidence to convict the other guy. So whenever there's prisoner's dilemmas, there's always going to be this tension. You know you're in a prisoner's dilemma, so you try to find a way out, but then competitive pressures will push you back in again, but you'll try to come out again, and it can get complicated. And it's one of the reasons why the prisoner's dilemma is so famous, because it's so rich and it can capture a lot of phenomenon out there. Thank you for listening to me.